So now we are in episode 2, part 2 rather, of the Peloponnesian War by kings and generals. We got into the background formation of what it's about. Now let's get into the actual meat of the war, as it's kind of kicked off. So yeah, let's get to it, shall we, my friends?
The Peloponnesian War was a decades-long, multi-part conflict, the first phase of which is often referred to as the Archidamian War, a name stemming from
Archidamos himself was against the war, making a speech against it, but relented due to Apellian demands.
from the Spartan king Archidamos, who initiated it after the Apelles' decision. This phase of the conflict lasted from 431 to 420 BCE. Thucydides describes its causes and conditions. Sparta technically initiated the conflict, but many Greek poleis were on their side, as they saw the Athenians as an emerging superpower to fear. Sparta itself claimed to be a liberator of Hellas from Athenian imperialism, a sort of defender of the free world. Meanwhile, Athens proclaimed itself to be a defender of democracy against repressive oligarchies. This mutual
Okay, so they're both claiming to be protection, which is always funny when I hear Sparta talking about freedom because they own so many slaves, like the 300 movie, like, you will see, Xerxes, that 300 stood against tyranny and slavery. I'm like, you're slave owners. Most of your population is slaves. You know what I mean? Sparta, you can't act all high and mighty, bro, and talk about freedom, but, I don't know, I guess hypocrisy is kind of around, you know? I think of America, like America and land of the free. Early America had slaves, so, you know, I guess it's kind of the same thing, huh? I love my country, but yeah, I'll admit, you know, obviously we're not perfect. Either way, I'm sorry, I always kind of laugh. Granted, I think owning slaves, obviously isn't just a Spartan thing in this ancient world, but it's like the Spartans had a lot. You know, they practiced it a lot. Either way, so Sparta's like, oh, we're fighting against your imperialism, and Athens like, hey, we uphold democracy, okay? We're not for oligarchies. Already, the ideological differences at play, am I right?
finger-pointing, so reminiscent of the Cold War of the 20th century, hid cynical geopolitical agendas. It should be noted that due to Thucydides' thorough habit of describing wars year by year, historians are blessed to have a comprehensive and reliable primary source that allows us to follow this conflict's incredibly complex shifting alliances pretty easily. The Peloponnesian...
Thank God for people who actually wrote down what was going on as, you know, as it's happening, or, you know, at least near when it's happening, right? Because we get to have better, more informative content. So I do appreciate that. Thank you, all historians out there.
League began the war by invading Attica, Athens' breadbasket. Almost every year throughout the war, the Spartans and their allies would invade this region in a scorched earth policy to starve out Athens. In retaliation, Athens blocked the Gulf of Corinth as a countermeasure. However, this did not stop the burnings in Attica from resulting in many civilian deaths, both from famine and pillaging, and many refugees from the Attican hinterlands fled behind the walls of Athens proper for protection. Immediately, Pericles began to face attacks from many angry Athenians, who questioned why he had dragged them into this war. Pericles tempered their panic by advising that their war would be won by strategy, and that their indomitable navy would be able to win the day, so long as they could avoid engaging the Spartans in ground combat, where...
I like how he says this war's gonna be won through strategy. Aren't all wars? No, I'm joking, I'm sorry. But in all seriousness, though, yeah, it's the navy you're gonna have to rely on, right? Like, that's your strength there. The Athenians are gonna have to rely on the navy to win, I feel. Because I feel like on land, I'm not fully aware of the prowess of the Athenian infantry, but we do know of Sparta, and they're good. You know, they're reaching their peak in a sense, you know, so yeah. You're gonna have to be really creative with the navy, though.
The Spartan hoplites were at their strongest. After a month of the initial pillaging spree, the Spartans and their allies returned home.
Sparta also had the Helots to control. Athenian public funerals were common for war heroes and included publicly funded tombs.
To participate in the harvest, as was the custom. Thus given a reprieve, at the end of this year, the city of Athens held a public funeral to honor the dead. Pericles recited his iconic Epitaphios Logos, or funeral oration,
Train at Universal Technical
at this funeral. Thucydides takes this opportunity to dissect Pericles' and Athens' ideology. We can see this in the Logos excerpt where Pericles honors the dead as heroes of the Athenian ideal. I would have you day by day fix your eyes upon the greatness of Athens until you become filled with the love of her, and when you are impressed by the spectacle of her glory, reflect that this empire has been acquired by men who knew their duty and had the courage to do it, who in the hour of conflict had the fear of dishonor always present to them, and who, if ever they failed in an enterprise, would not allow their virtues to be lost to their country, but freely gave their lives to her as the fairest offering which they could present at her feast. The sacrifice which they collectively made was individually repaid to them, for they received again each one for himself a praise which grows not old, and the noblest of all tombs. I speak not of that in which their remains are laid, but of that in which their glory survives, and is proclaimed always and on every fitting occasion, both in word and deed. For the whole earth is the tomb of famous men. Not only are they commemorated by columns and inscriptions in their own country, but in foreign lands there dwells also an unwritten memorial of them, graven not on stone, but in the hearts of men.
I find it interesting that he used the word empire there. I like that's all I took from that. He referred to the situation, them, as an empire. I find that interesting, but also just eloquently put. There's something about older language that's just so much more beautiful than nowadays. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, I was kind of like, as an English major, we have to like read the past. You know, I've read novels such as like Frankenstein, Shakespeare and whatnot. I don't know, just like, it seems like language back then, at least what written accounts we have, it just seemed like people spoke with like an odd sense of eloquence and beauty, and like in how they wrote, that I feel like isn't as prevalent nowadays. I don't know. I just find that interesting. Just coming up with the most eloquent insults in the is probably would have been amazing, you know. I don't know. That's just something I've always kind of noticed.
The Logos is remembered as an anti-capitulation song that tries to frame the deaths of Athenians as sacrifices made in the fight for a unique democratic ideal. Unlike the strictly militaristic Spartans, it also frames Athens as heroic for its participation in both mercantile and military affairs. Athenian lifestyle is extolled as outgoing and linked to the sea, and their adventurousness as something to be celebrated. Rather ironically, 1 year after Pericles gave this speech, the plague hit Athens, and Pericles himself died of it. Thucydides respects Pericles in his evaluation as a strong and vanguardist leader. In 429 BCE, the Peloponnesian League tried to shift the Athenian blockade off of the coast of Rhium, a small northwestern Peloponnesian coastal settlement. The Athenian navy was stretched thin at the time, having dispatched troops to both Plataea in Macedonia and to traditionally Dorian-leaning Crete. Thus, while the Peloponnesian League had sent 47 ships, mostly Corinthian in origin, the Athenians had only 20 ships to stand against them. On the Peloponnesian side, the Navag Cnemos amassed 1,000 hoplites from Sparta, as well as 2,000 hoplites from allied states, to attack a nearby city of Acarnania. In response, the Athenians sent out a team led by a commander called Phormio, the man responsible for controlling the blockades of both Naupactos and Rhium.
So Phormio only operated during this early period of the war, but it is considered to be one of the finest generals alongside Themistocles and Cimon.
to lead a direct assault on Rhium. These two battles were set to decide the blockade's fortune. The Rhium and Anti-Rhium are found near the modern city of Patra, where the Peloponnese comes the closest to touching the rest of Hellas at the shortest distance within the isthmus. Hence it was both the easiest to blockade and the most strategic location to attack. The Peloponnesians had a lot of transport ships in their midst, and so decided to use their trireme warships to defend these more vulnerable cargo-bearing vessels as they sailed past the narrow Rhium. Phormio had to decline sending help to Acarnania, but instead focused on the Peloponnesian convoy. Phormio, a major innovator in naval maneuvering, utilized the weather as a key part of his tactics. Seeing the heavily fortified Peloponnesian triremes, he decided to perform an unorthodox tactic. With 20 triremes of his own, he fanned them out to surround the Peloponnesian fleet and began to move ever closer. Approaching slowly, he sent smaller ships forward in a false dash attack to force the Peloponnesian ships into a defensive cluster.
Holy crap, he just literally circled them. Okay, this has some analogies to Themistocles' strategy and Salamis through without the wind. Yeah, like, it's interesting he had to specify he used the wind. I mean, I thought that would be a given, you know, because, like, ancient naval warfare, even up to, like, you know, before the invention of, like, steam engines, essentially, most of naval warfare seemed to have to rely on wind. So you think, I always thought that would be a given, like, use the wind, but, I don't know, I just find it interesting that had to be specified. But yeah, I guess it's his use that's really interesting. He essentially just circled them. Like, they just let it happen, just, okay, bye. Amazing maneuver. This is unique. We haven't seen a complete, like, circle like this so far on this channel.
The Peloponnesians were incapable of fighting back, though they could have attacked individual ships during their attack. Phormio had noticed
they're just going in circles. They are literally running circles around right now.
blew into the Gulf at dawn, and surmised that they could be used against the Peloponnesians. Just as Phormio had predicted, upon clustering, the Peloponnesians fell victim to the fickle weather, being blown away by the wind and crashing into each other, at which point the Athenians attacked.
Dude, this use of wind in battle is amazing. They're like air bending. Well, not really. They're more letting the air, you know, do its thing, but, like, you know what I mean. It's almost like as if they were air bending, just completely let nature do a job for them. That's pretty amazing. This is a pretty epic little one-sided battle right here, like, dang.
The Peloponnesian fleet was utterly crushed, with the Athenians capturing 12 ships and destroying the rest. Meanwhile, on the shore, Cnemis had reached the Acarnanian capital of Stratus and split his troops into 3 divisions. The left was manned by Spartans and Ambraciots, and was commanded by Cnemis. The center was made of barbarian mercenaries, and Leucadians and Anacoriates commanded the right. Cnemis himself was keen to encamp the divisions and begin negotiations. However, the center division, hoping for pillage and glory, continued to advance against Cnemis's wishes. They eventually faced the Stratians, only to discover that the defenders were experts in close combat. Thus, the barbarians were promptly sent packing. The other divisions were caught by surprise and formed ranks, but the Stratians lacked the forces to defeat them, so they did not press their advantage. However, the next day, Cnemis discovered that the rest of the Acarnanians were sending reinforcements, and thus decided to flee, meeting up with the survivors of the Peloponnesian fleet on the way. In both the naval battle at Rhium and the engagement at Plataea, the Athenians and their allies had emerged as the undisputed victors.
Back to back, dang, the Athenians starting off strong, winning both land and sea. Wow. I'm still amazed by the sea portion of that battle. Like, that was such a cool little display of, like, I don't know. I really love that. I found it funny, but also amazing. You know what I mean?
Phormio was also responsible for another battle, that of Naupactos, which took place in the same year. Everything began in Naupactos, where he was based. After the failed battle at Rhium, the survivors of the Peloponnesian fleet went to Kyllini in the west, where they met the Acarnanian invasion fleet and then received more reinforcements. Athens also sent reinforcements, but they were stuck in Crete, so he only had his 20 ships. He positioned himself in the Molocrian Rhium, with his enemies on the other side, the Peloponnesian Rhium. His sailors were anxious due to their low numbers, but so were the Peloponnesians due to their previous losses. Phormio promised his comrades that he would not fight in the narrow straits, but soon the Corinthians forced his hand. The Peloponnesians formed 4 lines, with the 20 fastest ships forward and the hoplites on shore. They began to move east to capture the base at Naupactos, so Phormio entered the straits to prevent this. The Peloponnesian fleet then went north and tried to trap the Athenians. 9 ships went onto the shore, while the other 11 Athenian ships escaped. The 9 crews either died or were captured, while the 11 were chased away by the 20 fast Peloponnesian ships. As they reached the Gulf of Corinth, 1 ship from each fleet went adrift, and the 10 Athenian survivor ships entered Naupactos. As the 2 adrift ships arrived, Athens rammed a merchant ship and sunk it, riling up the rest of the ships into fighting once more. The Peloponnesians had lost their formation and were decimated by the disciplined Athenian onslaught.
Again, the Athenians had the naval advantage, as we established earlier. Like, their use of the navy, it kind of it gives off sort of like, you know what I mean? I guess another optimal time is the optimal comparison would be like the Napoleonic era. You know, with one side being better on land and the other at sea, like, you know, like, the Athenians, or I guess the English in that comparison, because they just have the better navy, and they really need to press that advantage, because as we see, having a great navy could really dictate the flow of a war, so they really need to, like, definitely, you know, use that a lot more. They need to press that advantage as much as they can and do everything you can with a navy in war, you know? By the way, I do know how this all ends, you know, Sparta wins, but I'm still wanting to talk. As if I don't know that's gonna happen, you know?
They continued back into the trap, where they freed their comrades and captured 6 Peloponnesian ships. Both sides raised trophies after this battle, but the Athenians held off until their reinforcements arrived and ensured control of the Gulf of Corinth. Another battle, this time a defeat for the Athenians, took place in Spartolus, near the doomed city of Plataea, in the same year. An army of 2,000 Athenian hoplites and 200 cavalry, led by Xenophon, not the historian, the son of Euripides, marched up north in Chalkidiki to Spartolus, which was a bastion of anti-Athenian sentiment from formerly coastal populations kicked out by the Athenians. The city itself was fortified. However, as Athens arrived, the defenders, composed of hoplites, peltasts and auxiliaries from Spartolus, nearby Olynthus and nearby Chussis, moved out of the city to meet them. Athens' hoplites defeated the defending hoplites, and the auxiliaries retreated back into the city. But the goddess Nemesis was on their side that day. New peltast reinforcements arrived just after the retreat, and began to rain down on the Athenians. The defenders were encouraged by this and moved out once more. Athens retreated back into their camp and tried to push back. However, every time they pushed forward, the peltasts moved back, and upon Athenian retreat, the peltasts returned and rained hell on the Athenians, while the cavalry also assaulted the invaders. 430 Athenians, including their generals, were killed, and the rest moved back to Plataea in complete defeat.
Wow.
The death of Pericles allowed some of the allies who were not too keen on the war, like Lesbos, to try and break away from Athenian domination. These were quickly dealt with, as Athens had an unparalleled fleet at the time, capable of quashing any dissent in its alliance. Mytilene was another city that tried to reject Athenian overlordship, as they managed to back various revolts in Ionia and the nearby islands. We will return to the revolt in due course, but what is important is that Thebes, an ally of Sparta and a keen enemy of Athens, began encroaching upon Plataea. Initially, 300 Theban hoplites approached the city, where 2 oligarchic sympathizers let them in. These 2 Plataeans were hoping for a victory against the newly risen democratic factions in the city. The Plataeans were initially shocked into submission, but then realized their numerical superiority and killed over half of the Thebans, with the rest either captured or escaping. In this dire engagement, the Theban reinforcements could not aid their dying brethren due to the Asopos River flooding.
Wow.
Initially, both sides swore sacred oaths to negotiate the release of the Theban prisoners if Plataea was left alone. We don't know who broke the oaths taken, but the Thebans eventually began to attack again. The Plataeans called for Athenian help, while the Thebans appealed to Sparta. This is technically the official beginning of the Peloponnesian War. Archidamos sent an expeditionary force to burn the farmlands outside Plataea.
Plataea was meant to be a holy place after the harmonious battle against Persia in 4079 BCE.
Something the Plataean ambassador reminded the Spartans they were not allowed to do due to the holiness of Plataea. Sparta said they would only agree to protect them if they became neutral, but Plataea, which was very close to Athens in terms of both geography and ideology, rejected said proposal. Athens pushed the Plataeans to avoid agreeing to the terms, making the Plataeans more confident in the fact they could hold out until Athenian aid arrived. Archidamos thus began his work of besieging the city, beginning by constructing a wooden palisade around it. He managed to build a mound leading up to the walls, which he tried to use for an assault over the city walls. The Plataeans countered this measure by extending the height of their walls, while also digging under the walls and burrowing inside the Spartan mound, thus delaying the mound's construction. They also managed to build further fortifications inside the city using the materials from the mound, and thus had an additional means of defense in case of a Spartan breakthrough. The Spartans also built up siege engines, but these were ineffective, as the Plataeans used lassos and fire to disable these instruments of war. The Spartans continued.
Again, as we covered in part 1, it seemed the Athenians are no stranger to siegecraft and seem to be pretty decent at it. At least, also, you know, even helping out the Spartans, who I remember he specified, well, you know, he didn't say they weren't good at sieges. I think he just said they didn't excel so much in them, and that the Athenians stepped in to help them. So I think we're starting to see that kind of dynamic shown here. Like, yeah, the Spartans are trying to siege, but the Athenians are having counters, you know, and like really working with defenses. So I just think the Athenians are handling it much better, as we're seeing. But then again, this is far from over. Like, we'll see if the Spartans can adapt, you know.
To try to force their way through Plataea's walls for some time, but eventually they decided that it was fruitless and decided to simply sit back, surround the city, and starve it out instead. Their next step was to start throwing fire projectiles into the city proper. A large part of Plataea was destroyed by fire, but the Spartans missed the defensive positions, and thus their bombings only ended up amounting to an archaic form of terrorism. After this failure, the Spartans decided to simply double down on
Find the lowest price.
The Plataeans. To that end, the Lacedaemonians built a wall of circumvallation around Plataea, and seeing as they did not need most of their troops, dismissed a large part of the besieging force. Blockades are not a nice affair, and soon the Plataeans began to suffer the effects of malnutrition. The Spartan walls essentially were a two-way avenue, with walls outside for Spartan protection and the walls inside to lock off the city.
Again, Julius Caesar Alesia vibes. You know, walls and walls. Man, maybe Caesar studied these battles, because this is where he got his wall obsession from, you know. And okay, overall, yeah, they couldn't take the city by any, you know, offensive means in terms of, like, storming or siege engineering, but they went with the tried old, but usually more longer fashion of just starving them out, and that's good on them, you know? So, yeah.
City, with towers used for scouting and keeping sentries. The Spartans built wooden settlements in between the walls, so they could live within the walls, manned by Boeotian allies. According to Thucydides, the Plataeans had before sent off their wives and children and oldest men and the mass of the non-combatants to Athens, so that the number of besieged left in the place comprised 400 of their own citizens, 80 Athenians, and 110 women to bake their bread. This was the sum total at the commencement of the siege, and there was no one else within the walls, bond or free. Such were the arrangements made for the blockade of Plataea. The siege took 2 years, and inflicted incredible hardship.
2 years? Holy crap. Holy crap, dude. Okay, they were smart to send out everyone else before the siege got started, but they were confident. They're like, oh, we're gonna have Athenian aid, you know? We'll definitely defy the Spartans. And then 2 years pass, like, where's the aid? Like, I feel like I would give that, I would start thinking about that after, like, a few weeks, let alone 2 years, like... Wow.
Upon the population within the city. By the winter of 428 to 427 BC, provisions within the city began to grow thin, bringing desperation to the civilian population. The Plataeans decided to try and break out. At first, this was to be an attempt of the entire male population of the city to escape, but half of the garrison then decided that it was too dangerous. In the end, only 220 Plataean soldiers took part. They used ladders to climb over the walls, captured 2 of the 10 towers of the fortification, and managed to get across the outer wall before strong reinforcements could arrive. The Peloponnesian League tried to send 300 men as reinforcements, but by the time of their arrival, the Plataean escapees had fled to Athens. The Plataeans then moved up the road leading to Thebes, deceiving the besiegers who attempted to find them on the road to Athens. Eventually, 212 of the escapees managed to reach Athens. Thucydides claims that their success was mainly due to the darkness and the storm that was raging during the night. Even though the escapees managed to reach Athens, their pleas for aid fell on deaf ears. The Athenians were continuing to follow Pericles' strategy of avoiding direct ground combat with Sparta, and thus didn't send a relief force to Plataea for fear of being bogged down.
Wow, so they were like, resist, and Plataea's like, alright, we'll resist, because we're gonna get aid. And turns out the Athenians were never gonna send aid. Wow, that sucks so bad. Dude, that sucks so bad. Essentially just leaving them out to dry, right? That's how it comes across at the moment. Man, dude, Plataea, dude. Man, if they all had tried breaking out, definitely, maybe, who knows how much could it win. I mean, if 200 could do it, surely more could have made out, but again, I guess it's the fear, right? But I get that strategy. You don't want to give the Spartans the land advantage, because they already have that in terms of, you know, having... their prowess is known in terms of martial hoplite battle, but it's like... So, like, it's your strategy just to never fight them on land? Like, I don't know. That's a bit weird to me. Like, I guess they're just gonna have to rely fully on the navy, but I don't know.
By the summer of 427 BCE, the Plataeans and their allies inside the city were totally burnt out and starved, and thus the Spartans began their ominous assault. At this point, the Spartan commander tried to persuade the besieged that it would be better to surrender, that when a peace treaty was eventually negotiated, the Spartans would allow them to keep their land, and that only those who provoked the riot 2 years prior would be punished. The Plataeans agreed to those terms and surrendered. However, the Thebans were bitter and angry at the Plataeans and immediately put pressure on the Spartans to go harder on their vanquished foes. As a result, the Plataeans were brought into a show trial and condemned to death. All 200 Plataean and 25 Athenians who had survived the siege were executed, and the women who had remained in the city to...
Holy crap, dude. Completely went back on their word. Dang. To be fair, yeah, they did really backstab the Thebans, who when they walked in there and just completely butchered them. I guess, yeah, the consequences of your actions, right? But man, oh, that's brutal.
Cook for the garrison were sold into slavery. The Thebans took the land for themselves, and to rub salt in the wounds of the tragic city of Plataea, they then burnt the entire city to the ground. Plataea would not be rebuilt until 381 BC, when Philip of Macedon defeated the Thebans.
Wow, that's insane. Man, this war is gonna be brutal, I just know it, man.
The start of the Peloponnesian War proved to be a bittersweet win for Athens. They had lost their greatest statesman, and then had emerged victorious from important fights against overwhelming odds in the Peloponnese. However, they had also shown an unwillingness to help their allies, something which had cost the Plataeans dearly.
What kind of message does that send, right, to all the other allies of Athens? Like, oh, so you wouldn't help them. Does that mean you won't help? But you know what I mean? I'm wondering if it's going to play a part in all this. But it sends out a bad message, like, Athens can't protect its guys, you know? So yeah, a really bad message there, I think. That I'm not sure if it's going to have any future consequences or not.
Spartans had had a difficult start to the war. They had been humiliated in Rhium and Naupactos, but had rushed to the aid of Thebes and had delivered a crushing blow to Plataea. These contradictory positions of the two great powers would continue for the next decade, with equal levels of machinations and suffering for both sides.
And I will end the video here, and tomorrow we'll get to part 3. Bye everyone.